Hey everyone, tonight we are going to talk quietly about the first cities on Earth. Long ago, people stopped moving from place to place and began to live together in one spot. These early towns slowly grew into large cities. As we talk, we will focus on everyday life in these first cities. We will look at the work people did each day, the homes they lived in, and the jobs that kept the city going. Some of these jobs were very hard, and some were jobs no one wanted to do. We will spend most of our time in a place between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This land became home to some of the first cities like Uruk. Life there was busy, slow, and very different from today. If you enjoy calm and peaceful history stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support really helps, and it allows more quiet history stories to be shared. Now, let us begin the story. In a city like Uruk, every day began early. The sun rose over flat land and low buildings. There were no tall towers like today. Most homes were made from mud bricks. These bricks were shaped by hand and dried in the sun. People woke up on simple mats. Families often shared one or two rooms. There was little privacy. Sounds from nearby homes were easy to hear. Voices, footsteps, animals, and work noises filled the air. Cities brought safety in some ways. Walls protected people from attacks. Food was stored together. But cities also brought new problems. Trash, waste, and sickness became common. This meant some jobs were created only because cities existed. These jobs were not honored. They were not written about with pride. But they were needed every single day. One of the hardest everyday jobs was dealing with waste. In early cities, there were no pipes or drains like today. People used simple pits near their homes. Waste had to be removed by hand. Some workers carried waste away in baskets or jars. They walked through narrow streets. The smell followed them everywhere. They dumped the waste outside the city walls or into fields. This job was important. If waste stayed inside the city, sickness spread. But the people who did this work were often looked down on. They were paid little. They had no choice but to keep working. Imagine doing this work every day, the heat, the smell, the heavy loads. There were no gloves, no clean water nearby. What do you think it felt like to walk those streets each morning? Another hard job involved water. The rivers gave life, but they also caused problems. When rivers flooded, they brought rich soil. But floods could also destroy homes and crops. Cities needed canals to control water. Digging canals was slow and painful work. Men stood in mud for hours. They used simple tools made of wood and stone. The canals had to be cleaned often. Mud and plants blocked the flow of water. Workers removed this by hand. They bent over for long hours. Their backs and hands were always sore. This work was done under the sun. There was little shade. Breaks were short. Still, without canals, crops would fail. Food fed the city, so canal workers were needed, even if the job hurt the body. Inside the city, many people worked with clay. Clay was everywhere near the rivers. It was used to make bricks, bowls, and jars. It was also used for writing. Some workers shaped bricks all day. They pressed wet clay into wooden molds. They lifted heavy bricks and laid them out to dry. This work never ended. Cities were always growing. Walls needed repair. Homes collapsed in rain. Bricks had to be replaced again and again. Brick workers breathed dust every day. Their hands cracked from drying clay. Their bodies stayed bent for hours. It was honest work, but exhausting. Then there were the workers who carried goods. Cities depended on trade. Uruk traded grain, cloth, and tools. Goods came from far away. There were no carts with rubber wheels. Most loads were carried on backs or shoulders. Men and sometimes women carried heavy sacks of grain. They walked long distances inside the city. Markets were crowded and loud. Dust filled the air. People pushed past each other. Carriers were always moving. If they stopped, they were yelled at. If they dropped goods, they were punished. This work hurt the knees and spine. Many workers grew old quickly. Not all hard jobs were physical. Some were quiet but heavy in another way. Cities needed ordered. Rules had to be followed. Records had to be kept. Scribes wrote on clay tablets. They pressed symbols into wet clay using reeds. Learning to write took many years. But once trained, scribes worked long hours. They sat in small rooms, their eyes strained in low light. Mistakes could not be erased easily. If a scribe made an error in a record, it caused problems. Food counts, land borders, and debts depended on these marks. Though scribes were respected, the work was tiring and strict. They had little freedom. Religion also shaped daily work. Cities believed the gods controlled everything. Floods, harvests, sickness, and war were signs from the gods. Large temples stood at the center of cities. In Uruk, temples were tall and heavy. They were built from mud brick like everything else. Temple workers cleaned floors, prepared food, and cared for animals given as gifts. Some jobs involved sacrifice. Animals were killed as offerings. This work was serious and quiet. Mistakes were feared. People believed the gods would punish errors. Perhaps one of the worst everyday jobs was working in the fields owned by others. As cities grew, land became controlled by leaders and temples. Many people no longer owned their own land. They worked long days planting and harvesting crops. The sun was strong. Water was limited. Tools were simple. If crops failed, workers still owed food to leaders. Dead grew quickly. Some workers became bound to land. They could not leave. This was not slavery as later seen, but it was close. Life was hard and choices were few. Children also worked. They helped their families. They carried water. They watched animals. They learned trades early. There was little time for rest. Life moved slowly but steadily. At night, the city quieted. Fires burned low. People lay down tired. Their bodies hurt from the day. Tomorrow would be the same work, the same paths, the same tools. Cities were great achievements. They brought writing, trade, and shared life. But they also created hard, everyday jobs that never ended. As you rest now, think about those early workers. Their quiet lives built the world we know today. As cities like Uruk continued to grow, daily life became more organized, but also more demanding, because thousands of people living close together needed constant care and constant work to keep things from falling apart. Streets had to stay clear, food had to arrive on time, buildings had to be repaired after rain, and water had to keep flowing to fields outside the walls so the city could eat. None of this happened by chance. It happened because ordinary people woke up every morning and did jobs that were tiring, dirty, or simply never-ending. One of the least pleasant parts of city life was how close everything felt. Houses stood wall to wall, built from the same soft mud bricks, so when one family cooked or talked loudly, everyone nearby could hear it. Animals were often kept inside or just outside homes, which meant flies, smells, and noise were part of daily life. In warm weather, sickness spread easily, especially when waste was not removed quickly enough. This made the work of waste carriers even more important, even though they were often ignored or treated poorly. These workers moved slowly through the city, carrying heavy containers filled with waste from homes and shared pits. The streets were narrow, uneven, and crowded, so walking was careful and tiring. Spilling waste could lead to anger or punishment, because people feared sickness and bad smells. There were no rules to protect these workers, no special clothing, and no real way to clean themselves properly afterward. When their work was done, they returned home carrying the smell with them, which made it hard to escape their role in society. Water work was just as demanding, but in a different way. The canals that fed the fields and brought water close to the city were lifelines, and everyone knew that if the canals failed, hunger would follow. Canal workers often lived simple lives near the edges of the city, close to the water they worked with every day. Their skin was almost always wet or covered in dried mud. their hands rough from pulling plants and thick dirt from the canal beds. During hot seasons, the sun beat down on their backs for hours, and during cooler times, standing in water made their joints ache. The work followed the rhythm of the rivers, which could be calm for months, and then suddenly rise and flood. When floods came, canal workers were called out quickly to repair breaks, clear paths, and guide water away from homes. This was dangerous work because fast-moving water could knock a person down easily. Still, the work had to be done because the city depended on it. Inside the city walls, building never truly stopped. Mud bricks were strong enough for daily life but weak against time and weather. So walls cracked, roofs sagged, and floors washed away during heavy rain. Brickmakers worked almost every day, shaping clay, lifting molds, stacking bricks, and laying them out in long rows under the sun. The work required strength and patience, because a mistake in shape or drying could ruin many bricks at once. These workers were always covered in dust, and breathing it day after day likely damaged their lungs, even though no one understood this at the time. Their reward was steady work, but little comfort, because the city always needed more bricks as it grew outward and upward. Trade brought color and movement to the city, but it also depended on physical labor that wore people down. Goods arriving from outside regions had to be unloaded, counted, and moved by hand. Grain sacks were heavy, jars were fragile, and tools were sharp. Carriers learned how to balance loads carefully across their shoulders or backs, often using cloth or rope to prevent injury, though pain was still common. Markets were busy places where smells of food, animals, sweat, and dust mixed together. Carriers moved quickly through crowds, listening for shouted orders and watching for obstacles. A fall or a broken jar could lead to punishment or loss of pay. These workers were always alert, always tired, and rarely thanked. Not all difficult jobs were visible in the streets. Many people worked long hours indoors, especially those connected to temples and storage buildings. Grain had to be measured and stored properly, because it fed the city through seasons when fields were empty. Workers checked containers for damage, guarded storage rooms, and recorded amounts using simple marks and symbols. Scribes, who recorded this information, held an important place in the city, but their daily life was strict and demanding. Training began young, often in temple schools where children learned to press symbols into clay with careful hands. Writing was slow and tablets were heavy, so scribes worked at low tables or on the floor for many hours at a time. Errors meant starting over, and mistakes could cause serious trouble if food or land records were wrong. Religion touched every part of city life, and many jobs existed only because people believed the gods needed care, gifts, and attention. Temples owned land, animals, and storage buildings, making them powerful centers of work. Temple workers cleaned spaces daily, prepared offerings, and followed rules meant to keep the gods pleased. Some tasks involved blood, noise, and strong smells, especially during sacrifices, which could be emotionally difficult even if they were considered sacred. Farming, which once gave people freedom to move and choose land, became more controlled in city life. Large fields were owned by leaders or temples, and many workers labored on land that was not theirs. Their days began early and ended late, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Water had to be managed carefully, weeds removed by hand, and crops protected from animals and weather. If harvests were poor, workers still owed grain, which led to debt. Over time, debt trapped families into working the same land year after year with little chance to improve their lives. This system kept the city fed, but placed heavy pressure on those at the bottom. Children grew up watching this work and joined in as soon as they were able. Childhood was short because survival required everyone's effort. Young people learned skills from parents repeating the same tasks and following the same paths through the city. When night came, the city did not become silent, but it did slow down. Fires glowed softly, voices lowered, and tired bodies rested on mats or floors. Tomorrow promised the same work, the same routines, and the same quiet struggles. These everyday jobs, though often unseen and uncelebrated, were the foundation of the first cities on Earth. Without them, places like Uruk could not have existed, and human history would have taken a very different path. As you listen and rest, you can imagine the steady rhythm of those lives, moving slowly through time, building something larger than themselves, without ever knowing how far their efforts would reach. Far from Mesopotamia, along the Nile River in Egypt, people also began living in large settled communities very early. The Nile flooded each year, leaving behind wet soil that was good for farming, and this allowed villages to grow into towns and then into cities. Life near the river followed a strict schedule because planting and harvesting depended on the water level, and this made daily work very organized, but also very demanding for ordinary workers. One of the hardest everyday jobs in early Egyptian cities involved working directly with the river itself. The Nile was the source of life, but it was also dangerous and unpredictable. Workers were needed to measure the water level each year, clean river edges, repair small banks, and clear paths for boats. These workers spent much of their lives near water, dealing with mud, insects, and animals such as snakes and crocodiles. There was no real protection, and injuries were common. Falling into the river while carrying tools or supplies could easily mean death. Transport work was also extremely hard in early Egyptian cities because stone, grain, and building materials had to be moved long distances without modern tools. Large stones used for temples, storage buildings, and city walls were dragged using wooden sleds, ropes, and human strength. Teams of workers pulled together for hours at a time under strong sun, following shouted orders to stay in step. The work demanded full effort from the body, and people who grew weak or sick were often replaced without concern. In cities along the Nile, food storage was a constant concern because floods could fail or arrive too strong. Grain workers were responsible for drying crops, storing them safely, and protecting them from insects and moisture. This work took place inside dark storage rooms where air did not move much. Dust from grain filled the lungs, and workers often developed breathing problems, even though no one understood why. Guards watched over these stores, but guards themselves worked long shifts with little rest, knowing that theft or spoilage could bring harsh punishment. Another unpleasant but necessary job involved preparing bodies for burial. Early Egyptian belief placed strong importance on death and the afterlife, and even before large pyramids existed, cities required workers to clean, prepare, and wrap bodies. This work exposed people to sickness, strong smells, and emotional strain. These workers were needed every day because death was part of city life, especially where sickness spread easily. Despite the religious importance of burial, those who performed this work were often kept apart from others. Craft work also had its darker side. Metal workers who worked with copper and later bronze faced daily danger from heat and smoke. Furnaces burned hot, and air inside workshops was thick with fumes. Burns were common, and tools were heavy and sharp. These workers produced knives, farming tools, and building parts that everyone depended on, yet their own health suffered slowly over time. Moving east, another early city culture grew in the Indus Valley, in places like Mohenjo-Daro. These cities were carefully planned with straight streets and advanced drainage systems, which required constant upkeep. While the design was impressive, maintaining it created difficult jobs that had to be done daily. Drain cleaners worked underground or in narrow stone channels, removing waste, mud, and blocked water paths. This was dirty, physical work done in tight spaces with little light and fresh air. The drains of Indus cities carried waste water away from homes, but they clogged easily due to dirt, food scraps, and daily use. Clearing these drains required workers to lift stone covers, climb into channels, and scrape away blockages by hand. The smell was strong, and contact with waste caused illness. These workers were essential to city health, but they likely lived on the edges of society, valued for their labor, but avoided in daily life. Brick production was also a constant task in Indus cities because fired bricks were used widely. Brick kilns burned day and night, fed by wood and other fuels that had to be gathered from surrounding areas. Workers who tended these kilns endured intense heat for long hours, watching fires carefully to avoid ruining batches of bricks. Smoke filled their eyes and lungs, and burns were a daily risk. Still, the city depended on bricks for homes, drains, and public buildings. In all early cities, animals were part of daily life, and caring for them created difficult work. City workers fed, cleaned, and controlled animals used for food, transport, or labor. Slaughtering animals was especially hard work, involving blood, heavy tools, and strong smells. Meat spoiled quickly in warm climates, so this work had to be done fast and carefully. Mistakes led to sickness, which made the job stressful and unpleasant. In early cities across different regions, punishment and control were also forms of labor. Guards, watchers, and enforcers kept order in crowded spaces where conflict was common. These workers walked streets at night, broke up fights, protected storage areas, and enforced rules set by leaders or priests. Their work exposed them to violence and danger, and they were often blamed when things went wrong, even if problems were beyond their control. Debt labor existed in many early cities, not just in Mesopotamia. People who could not repay what they owed were forced into long periods of work for others. These workers performed the hardest tasks, such as clearing land, hauling materials, and working in unhealthy conditions. Their lives were closely controlled, and their families often shared their burden. Escape was rare, and hope depended on good harvests or changes in leadership. Women in early cities often carried double workloads. They managed homes, prepared food, fetched water, and cared for children, while also producing goods like cloth, pottery, or food for trade. Grinding grain by hand was one of the most tiring daily tasks, requiring hours of repetitive motion that strained arms and backs. This work was done daily, often starting before sunrise and repeating again in the evening. Children were part of the workforce as soon as they were physically able. They carried water, gathered fuel, watched animals, and assisted adults in workshops. Injuries were common, and education was limited to learning tasks needed for survival. Life in a city demanded constant effort from everyone, regardless of age. Across all early cities, one shared truth remained clear. City life depended on jobs that were uncomfortable, unhealthy, and exhausting. Jobs that left little trace in written records, but formed the base of organized society. These workers did not build monuments or write laws, but they kept water flowing, food stored, streets clear, and cities alive. In early China, along the Yellow River, people also formed some of the first large settled cities. The river brought water and rich soil, but it was known for sudden floods that destroyed homes and fields. Because of this, one of the hardest everyday jobs in these early Chinese cities was flood control. Workers were forced to build and rebuild riverbanks using packed earth, wood, and stone, knowing that one strong flood could undo months or even years of work. This labor was not seasonal comfort work but constant effort, because the river changed its path often and without warning. Flood control workers lived close to the river, often in poor housing that could be washed away. They carried heavy baskets of dirt on their backs, walking up and down embankments all day. Tools were simple, usually wooden shovels and baskets tied with rope. When floods came, these workers were expected to act immediately, sometimes standing in rushing water to block breaks or guide water away from homes. Many drowned, but their deaths were rarely recorded. The work continued because the cities depended on it to survive. Farming near early Chinese cities was tightly controlled by rulers, and large groups of workers were organized to plant and harvest crops at the same time. These farming workers often lived under strict rules and were punished for working too slowly or failing to meet grain demands. Harvest time meant long days bent over fields, cutting crops by hand and carrying heavy bundles to storage areas. During dry years, the pressure was even worse, because missing grain could lead to punishment or forced labor in other projects. Another difficult job in early Chinese cities involved salt production. Salt was necessary for preserving food, especially meat and fish, but producing it required dangerous and exhausting work. Workers boiled salt water over fires for long hours, breathing thick smoke and steam. The heat caused burns, and the work strained the eyes and lungs. Salt workers were often kept under close watch because salt was valuable, and escape from this work was rare once assigned. Bronze working was important in early Chinese cities, especially for weapons, tools, and ritual objects. Bronze workers operated furnaces that burned extremely hot, fueled by charcoal made from cut forests. These workers labored in enclosed spaces filled with smoke and metal fumes. Molten metal could splash and cause serious burns. The work required focus and strength, and mistakes ruined expensive materials, leading to harsh punishment. Even though bronze items were prized, the workers who made them lived short and difficult lives. In the growing cities of early China, road and wall construction was another constant demand. City walls were large and thick, built from packed earth layers pressed down by hand. Workers used wooden tools to pound the earth again and again until it hardened. This work destroyed joints and muscles over time. Many workers were prisoners, debt laborers, or people sent by local leaders as part of labor taxes. They worked under guards and were given little rest. Moving to the Americas, early cities also formed without metal tools or animals for heavy transport. In the Andes region of South America, early city centers required huge amounts of human labor to build terraces, roads, and storage buildings. One of the hardest jobs involved cutting and shaping stone using only stone tools. Workers struck rock for hours, slowly shaping blocks through repeated blows. Progress was slow, and injuries to hands and arms were common. Carrying stone in the Andes was especially difficult because of the mountains. There were no wheeled carts, so everything was moved by human strength. Workers carried heavy loads on their backs using straps around the head or chest. Steep paths made the work dangerous, and falls were common. Even so, construction never stopped, because storage buildings and walls were essential for survival in harsh environments. In early American cities, food storage work was critical. Crops like maize had to be dried and protected from moisture and animals. Storage workers checked buildings daily, repaired damage, and removed spoiled food. Rotting grain attracted insects and caused illness. This work required constant attention and brought little respect, even though failure could lead to hunger for entire communities. In Mesoamerica, early cities, such as those built by the Olmec and later cultures, depended heavily on farming supported by water control. Workers drained swampy land, dug channels, and cleared vegetation by hand. This work exposed them to insects, heat, and disease. Mosquitoes spread illness, and cuts easily became infected. Despite this, these tasks were repeated year after year because they allowed cities to grow. Stone carving was another difficult job in these regions. Large stone heads, platforms, and temples required thousands of hours of labor. Workers quarried stone far from cities, then transported it slowly using ropes and human strength. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous. Crushing injuries occurred when stones slipped or rolled. Still, the work continued because leaders demanded visible signs of power and belief. Across early cities in many regions, fire management was an everyday responsibility that created hard jobs. Fires were needed for cooking, metalwork, pottery, and warmth, but uncontrolled fires could destroy entire neighborhoods built from wood and mud. Fire watchers stayed alert, especially at night, scanning for smoke or sparks. They moved quickly to control flames using water, dirt, or blankets. These workers faced danger regularly, yet failure could bring severe punishment. Pottery production was another job that looked simple, but was physically demanding. Potters spent long hours shaping clay, turning wheels by hand, lifting heavy wet vessels, and firing them in kilns. Kiln work exposed workers to heat and smoke similar to metal work, though without the same status. Broken pottery meant lost time and wasted effort. Still, cities needed pots for storage, cooking, and trade, so production never stopped. Cloth production created constant labor as well. Spinning thread and weaving fabric required many hours of repetitive motion. Workers, often women, spun fibers by hand and wove on simple looms. This work strained eyes, hands. Cloth was needed for clothing, trade, and social status, so demand was high. Even children were often involved in spinning or preparing fibers. In all these early cities, the worst everyday jobs shared common features. They were necessary, physically hard, poorly rewarded, and often dangerous. People performing these jobs had little choice and few protections. Their lives followed strict routines, shaped by the needs of the city rather than personal comfort. As you continue listening quietly, the slow movement of these workers across different lands and times forms a steady pattern of human effort, showing how early cities depended not on great leaders alone, but on constant, demanding work carried out by ordinary people every day. In early cities around the eastern Mediterranean, long before classical Greece, people lived in crowded settlements where the land was rocky and farming was hard. Cities grew because of trade, fishing, and control of ports rather than rich soil. This created a different set of everyday jobs, many of which were exhausting and risky. One of the hardest jobs in these coastal cities was working on the water, not as a trader or leader, but as a basic laborer who handled ships, nets, and cargo. Dock workers spent their days loading and unloading ships made of wood and rope. Ships arrived carrying stone, wood, grain, oil, and people. There were no cranes or machines. Everything was lifted by hand. Workers balanced on wet planks, often barefoot, passing heavy items from one person to the next. A slip meant falling into the water or being crushed by cargo. Storms could arrive quickly, and workers were expected to keep working unless conditions became deadly. Fishing was also hard labor in early cities. Small boats were pushed out before sunrise. Nets were heavy and tangled easily. Pulling them back required strength and teamwork. Fish spoiled quickly in warm air, so the work had to be fast. Fishermen cleaned fish by hand on shore, dealing with sharp tools, blood, and strong smells. Their hands were often cut and infected. Even though cities depended on fish for food, fishermen lived with constant risk. Salt preservation was closely tied to fishing and trade. In coastal cities, salt workers gathered seawater into shallow pools and waited for the sun to dry it. This meant standing and walking for hours in bright light that burned the skin and eyes. The salt dried the hands until they cracked and bled, carrying sacks of salt added to the strain. Once salt was collected, it had to be stored carefully, watched, and transported inland by people who walked long distances carrying heavy loads. Inland from the coast, early cities depended on mining. Stone, copper, and other materials were pulled from the earth using hand tools. Miners worked in dark tunnels with little air. They used fire to weaken rock, then broke it apart with stone hammers. Smoke filled the tunnels, making it hard to breathe. Collapses were common, and many workers died underground without ceremony. This work was usually done by people with no other choice, including prisoners and those in debt. The material taken from mines fed other difficult jobs inside the city. Stone cutters shaped blocks for walls, storage rooms, and public buildings. This work required constant striking, lifting, and adjusting. Dust filled the air and coated the skin. Over time, workers lost strength in their hands and joints. Still, construction never paused, because cities were always repairing damage or expanding. In some early cities, especially those controlling trade routes, there were people whose job was simply to count, inspect, and guard goods passing through gates. These workers stood for long hours in heat or cold, watching animals, carts, and people move in and out. They carried out orders strictly, because mistakes could mean punishment. Though their job seemed simple, the long hours and constant pressure made it exhausting. Crowded cities also created constant demand for food preparation on a large scale. Grinding grain was one of the most tiring daily jobs. Grain was crushed using heavy stone tools that required repeated movement for hours. This work damaged the back, shoulders, and hands. Teeth of grain grinders often wore down early because stone dust mixed into food. This work was done every day, sometimes twice a day, without rest. Bakers worked near open fires in small rooms with poor airflow. Heat built up quickly. Bread had to be baked fast and in large amounts. Burns were common. Smoke irritated the lungs and eyes. Mistakes wasted precious food and could lead to punishment. Still, bread was a basic food, and the city depended on it daily. In early cities, clothing production also involved hard labor. Washing cloth required large amounts of water, soap made from ash or fat, and constant movement. Workers beat fabric against stones to clean it. This strained arms and hands. Dyeing cloth was even worse. Dyes were made from plants, insects, or minerals and often smelled strong or irritated the skin. Workers stood in vats for long periods, breathing fumes and staining their bodies permanently. Some cities developed early forms of policing or enforcement, and these jobs were unpleasant in different ways. Enforcers were sent to collect debts, force labor, or punish rule breakers. This work made them feared and disliked. They faced anger, violence, and blame from both sides. Though they had authority, their lives were unstable, and they were often replaced or punished themselves if order broke down. Disease control was another unseen burden in early cities. When sickness spread, certain people were tasked with removing the sick or dead from crowded areas. They cleaned homes, burned items, or carried bodies away. These workers faced the highest risk of infection. There was no understanding of germs, only fear. People avoided them, even though their work protected the city. In cities with early markets, animals were sold and slaughtered daily. Slaughter workers handled knives, restrained animals, and cleaned remains. This work required strength and speed. Blood soaked the ground. Waste attracted insects and animals. The smell stayed on clothes and skin. Despite this, meat supply depended on them, especially during festivals or large gatherings. As cities grew older, they layered new work on top of old systems. Roads wore down, drains clogged, storage buildings cracked, and walls weakened. Repair work was constant and repetitive. There was no sense of finishing a job forever. Everything needed attention again and again. Workers learned that effort did not lead to relief, only to more tasks. People doing the hardest everyday jobs rarely moved upward in society. Their children often took the same roles, learning through watching and helping. Skill mattered, but choice was limited. City life brought structure, safety, and trade, but it also locked many people into work that drained their bodies slowly over time. As early cities became more complex, new kinds of everyday work appeared that had nothing to do with farming, building, or trade, but instead came from the simple fact that many people were living close together for the first time in human history. When thousands of people share space, time, and resources, someone has to manage problems that never existed in small villages, and those jobs were often some of the most tiring and least respected. One such job was noise control and order keeping during daily life. Early cities were loud places from sunrise to sunset. Animals cried, tools struck stone and wood, people argued, merchants shouted prices, and children ran through narrow streets. There were no quiet zones. In many cities, certain people were assigned to keep order during busy hours, especially near markets, temples, or storage areas. These workers spent the day breaking up fights, calming crowds, and stopping theft. They were constantly surrounded by anger and stress. And if something went wrong, they were often blamed by leaders and hated by the public at the same time. Another demanding role involved timekeeping and signaling. Early cities depended on shared schedules for work, worship, trade, and storage access. Someone had to watch the sky, track shadows, or observe water clocks, then signal the start or end of activities. This could mean standing in the same place for hours, exposed to sun or cold, watching carefully and staying alert. Mistakes caused confusion, missed work, or anger from leaders. Though this job sounds simple, it required constant focus and brought little reward. Crowded cities also created a serious problem with animals. Dogs, pigs, goats, and birds moved freely through streets, feeding on scraps and waste. While useful, these animals spread dirt and disease. Certain workers were tasked with keeping animals out of temples, storage rooms, and homes of the wealthy. They chased animals away, repaired fences, and cleaned areas where animals gathered. This work was endless because animals returned quickly. Bites, scratches, and sickness were common. Firewood collection became another exhausting daily task in and around cities. As cities grew, nearby trees disappeared. Workers had to travel farther each year to gather wood for cooking, pottery, metalwork, and heating. This meant long walks carrying heavy loads back to the city. Over time, forests moved farther away, and the work became harder and more dangerous. Still, without wood, daily life stopped. Early cities also needed constant cleaning beyond waste removal. Dust from roads, workshops, and building sites built up everywhere. Some workers swept streets, cleaned public areas, and cleared temple grounds. This work was done early in the morning or late at night. Dust filled the lungs. Progress was quickly undone by daily activity. The work never felt complete. Another difficult and overlooked job involved caring for the sick. In early cities, sickness spread fast because of close living conditions and poor sanitation. People did not understand illness, but they knew it needed attention. Caregivers cleaned bodies, changed cloths, brought water, and removed waste from sick rooms. They were exposed to illness daily. Fear surrounded them. Many caregivers were family members with no choice, but in some cases, certain people were assigned this work repeatedly, especially during outbreaks. Death management was a constant reality in city life. When people died in crowded neighborhoods, their bodies had to be removed quickly. Workers carried bodies through streets, often at night, to burial areas or burning grounds. This work was physically heavy and emotionally draining. The smell of death followed them. Others avoided them. Yet, without this work, disease and fear spread even faster. In cities with early written rules, enforcement created another kind of daily burden. Messengers carried orders, warnings, and punishments from leaders to the public. This meant walking long distances, repeating messages loudly, and facing anger from those who received bad news. Messengers were often attacked or blamed for decisions they did not make. Their work required endurance and courage. but brought little safety. Storage protection was also constant and stressful work. Cities depended on stored food to survive poor seasons. Guards watched storage rooms day and night. They slept little and stayed alert, knowing that theft could bring severe punishment. During shortages, guards faced desperate people trying to steal food. Violence was always possible. Guards were both feared and resented, yet easily replaced. Early cities also produced large amounts of broken tools, pottery, and building material. Someone had to deal with this waste. Recycling meant crushing old bricks, grinding broken pottery, and reusing materials. This work was dusty and repetitive. Sharp edges caused cuts. Progress was slow. The work existed only because cities created constant wear and damage. Crowded living also meant frequent disputes. Neighbors argued over space, noise, animals, water access, and shared walls. Some workers acted as mediators or local watchers, listening to complaints and reporting problems. This job involved constant tension. No one was satisfied. Mediators carried stress home and were often blamed for unresolved issues. Water access inside cities required constant management. Wells had to be protected, cleaned, and controlled. Water carriers filled jars and delivered water to homes without direct access. Carrying water meant lifting heavy containers repeatedly throughout the day. Spilled water wasted effort and brought punishment. Slippery streets increased the risk of falls. This work strained the body and never truly ended. Markets created another kind of pressure. Inspectors checked weights, measures, and quality of goods. This work required attention and honesty. Inspectors faced bribes, threats, and anger from merchants. Mistakes could lead to shortages or unfair trade. Though important, this job was stressful and socially isolating. Public celebrations and religious events also created hidden labor. Before festivals, workers cleaned spaces, prepared food, set up structures, and controlled crowds. During events, they managed order and safety. Afterward, they cleaned waste, broken items, and animal remains. Festivals looked joyful, but the work behind them was exhausting and often unpleasant. As cities aged, their systems became heavier. Every solution created new problems. Every structure required maintenance. Every rule required enforcement. Every gathering created waste. This meant more everyday jobs that were repetitive, tiring, and invisible. People doing these jobs rarely received recognition. They were simply expected to continue. Children growing up in cities learned early that work filled life. They watched adults sweep, carry guard, clean, and repair. Many stepped into these roles naturally, not by choice but by need. City life taught that survival depended on constant effort, not comfort. Through all early cities, across time and place, the worst everyday jobs shared a common feature. They existed because people chose to live together. Cities brought safety, trade, and culture, but they also created endless work that small groups never needed. This work formed the quiet base of human civilization. When early cities grew larger, one of the biggest changes in daily life was the loss of personal space and control over time. In small villages, people worked for their families and rested when they could. In cities, time began to belong to the city itself. Someone had to make sure work started, continued, and ended as planned, and this created hard jobs that were not physical in the usual way, but heavy in pressure and stress. One such job was supervising labor groups. These were not leaders in the modern sense, but ordinary people placed above others to watch work crews in fields, building sites, canals, or storage areas. Their task was to keep people moving, stop rest that lasted too long, and report problems upward. They stood all day, watching others strain their bodies, knowing that if work slowed, they would be punished too. Workers below them resented them, while leaders above them distrusted them. This job placed a person in constant tension, with no safe place on either side. Another difficult everyday job involved counting people rather than goods. As cities began collecting labor taxes, someone had to track who owed work, who showed up, and who tried to avoid it. These counters walked through neighborhoods, checking names, faces, and marks on clay or wood. They faced anger from families who were already exhausted. Lies were common. Threats were common. Still, the work continued because city projects depended on organized labor. Cities also created constant shortages. Food, water, wood, and space were never enough for everyone at the same time. Distribution workers managed these shortages by handing out rations or granting access to resources. This meant deciding who received enough and who did not. People doing this work faced begging, shouting, and sometimes violence. Even when they followed orders exactly, they were blamed by those who suffered. This job weighed heavily on the mind, day after day. Another job that became common in early cities was guarding boundaries inside the city itself. These were not outer walls, but inner divisions between storage areas, temple grounds, work zones, and living spaces. Guards stood in the same spots for hours, stopping people from entering places they needed or wanted to reach. Hunger made people desperate. Guards were pushed, argued with, and sometimes attacked. Their work required constant alertness, and mistakes were punished harshly. As cities grew denser, smells became a serious problem. Tanners, dye makers, and workers who processed animal skins created strong odors that spread through nearby homes. City leaders often forced these workers to move or confine their work to certain areas. This created the job of enforcing smell control, which meant ordering people to move their work, destroy tools, or limit production. These enforcers were hated by both workers and neighbors. They solved one problem while creating another. Leather working itself was one of the worst everyday jobs. Preparing animal skins required soaking them in water mixed with waste, scraping hair and flesh away, and stretching them to dry. The process smelled strong and attracted insects. Workers stood in foul mixtures with bare hands and feet. Cuts became infected easily. Still, leather was needed for shoes, straps, and tools, so the work continued daily. Early cities also required constant supply of building material beyond stone and brick. Reeds, straw, and fibers were gathered to make roofs, mats, baskets, and ropes. This gathering work took place outside the city, often in wet or dangerous areas. Workers were bitten by insects, exposed to weather, and carried heavy bundles back over long distances. The work was repetitive and offered little chance to improve one's life. Rope making was another unseen but essential job. Rope was needed for hauling, lifting, tying animals, and building. Making rope required twisting fibers by hand for long periods, often while walking backward to keep tension. This strained the hands, shoulders, and back, fingers cracked and blood. Still, cities used enormous amounts of rope every day, and production never stopped. Inside homes, fuel management was a constant burden. Fires had to be lit, fed, and controlled daily. Ashes had to be removed. Sparks could start fires easily in crowded neighborhoods. Some people were tasked with checking household fires or responding to small fires before they spread. This meant moving quickly through narrow streets with water or dirt, often at night. These workers slept lightly and were always ready to move. Another hard job involved repairing tools. In early cities, tools broke often because they were used constantly. Tool repair workers sharpened blades, fixed handles, and reshaped damaged items. This work required patience and precision. Small mistakes made tools useless. Repairers worked with sharp edges close to their hands and eyes. Despite their importance, they were blamed when tools failed during critical work. Crowded cities also meant constant movement of people. Travelers, traders, workers from nearby villages, and messengers passed through daily. Gate workers controlled entry and exit checked goods, counted animals, and enforced rules. They worked long hours exposed to dust, sun, rain, and cold. They faced anger from travelers delayed or turned away. Bribes were common, and refusal brought threats. In many early cities, prisons or holding areas existed in simple forms. Guards watched people accused of crimes or debt violations. These holding spaces were cramped and dirty. Guards dealt with sickness, fear, and desperation. Violence was always possible. The job required constant watchfulness, often at night, with little rest or respect. Waste beyond human waste also needed handling. Broken food, animal remains, ash, and workshop scraps piled up quickly. Workers removed this waste from city centers to dumping areas. Carrying rotting material was unpleasant and unhealthy. Animals followed them. The smell stayed in clothing and hair. This work existed only because cities produced more waste than nature could absorb quickly. Early cities also created loneliness. Surrounded by people, many still lacked support. Some workers were assigned to watch over or assist those who could not care for themselves, such as the injured, elderly, or abandoned. This work involved lifting bodies, cleaning wounds, and providing food with limited supplies. Emotional strain was heavy, and success was uncertain. As belief systems grew, rituals became more frequent and complex. Preparing ritual spaces required cleaning, decoration, animal handling, and crowd control. Workers rehearsed movements, arranged objects, and enforced silence or order. Mistakes were feared because they were believed to anger higher powers. Pressure during rituals was intense, especially for those with low status. When rituals ended, cleanup followed. Blood, food remains, broken items, and waste covered public spaces. Workers cleaned through the night so the city could function the next day. Their effort erased visible signs of the event, making their work easy to forget. Over time, early cities became systems that demanded constant attention. Every role supported another. When one task failed, others suffered. This meant that even the worst everyday jobs were tightly connected to survival. People could not simply stop. Life for these workers moved at a steady pace, shaped by routine rather than choice. Morning brought the same paths, the same tools, and the same expectations. Evening brought tired bodies and short rest. Tomorrow promised more of the same. In small villages, disagreements were personal and short. In cities, conflict became constant. Someone had to live inside that tension every day. These workers were often elders, appointed watchers, or low-level officials whose role was to hear complaints, calm arguments, and prevent violence before it spread. Their days were spent walking from one dispute to another, listening to shouting, accusations, and grief. They were rarely thanked because no one felt satisfied afterward. When violence did happen, they were blamed for failing. Crowded cities created constant pressure around water access. Wells, canals, and shared containers were never enough for everyone at the same time. Water carriers and water guards had some of the most exhausting and hated jobs. They stood near water points, deciding who could fill containers and when. During dry seasons, tempers rose quickly. People pushed, argued, and fought. Water workers faced threats daily. They carried heavy jars back and forth for hours. Their backs bent and shoulders strained, knowing that spilling water meant wasted effort and anger from those waiting. Another deeply unpleasant job involved latrine control and public sanitation, which grew more complex as cities expanded. Early cities began building shared waste areas instead of simple household pits. These places needed daily care. Workers cleaned pits, cleared blockages, and spread waste away from living areas. The work was slow, dirty, and dangerous. Gases from waste caused dizziness. Insects covered their bodies. Cuts became infected easily. These workers were avoided by others, even after their work was done. As cities became trade centers, deception increased. Measuring grain, cloth, oil, and metal fairly was critical, but cheating was common. Some workers were assigned to verify weights and measures repeatedly throughout the day. This job required constant alertness and honesty. Merchants resented them. Buyers blamed them when prices were high. Bribes were offered. Threats followed refusal. Standing firm made enemies on all sides. This job carried mental strain that never ended. Early cities also required constant animal control, which went far beyond feeding or slaughter. Animals wandered streets, damaged goods spread waste, and caused injury. Workers chased animals away from crowded areas, separated fighting animals, and removed injured or dead ones. This meant working close to unpredictable creatures without protection. Bites, kicks, and infections were common. The work was endless because animals returned quickly. One of the most physically draining everyday jobs involved manual grinding and crushing, especially for food and building material. Grain was ground daily using heavy stones. Pigment for walls and ritual objects was crushed by hand. Minerals were broken down for medicine, dye, or metalwork. This work required hours of repeated motion with no variation. Over time, joints wore down. Fingers lost strength. Pain became constant. Yet this work was essential to daily life and could not be skipped. Cities also created constant demand for messenger labor, which was far more dangerous than it sounds. Messengers carried information across crowded streets, between cities, or into rural areas. They delivered bad news orders and punishment notices. Many were attacked by those who did not want to hear the message. Travel was done on foot through heat, rain, and darkness. Mistakes in delivery brought severe consequences. Despite this, messengers were poorly rewarded and easily replaced. Another difficult role involved managing crowds during food distribution. When grain was handed out or sold cheaply, large groups gathered quickly. Distribution workers stood between hunger and supply. They counted portions, enforced rules, and stopped people from taking more than allowed. This meant standing face to face with desperate families. Shouting, pushing, and violence were common. Workers feared injury and punishment if supplies ran short. Inside workshops, apprentices and low-skilled workers often performed the most punishing tasks. They cleaned tools, carried fuel, removed waste, and handled broken materials. Their work was repetitive and physically demanding, but offered little learning or advancement. Injuries were common, and rest was rare. These workers learned early that city life demanded obedience more than skill. As early cities developed systems of belief and ritual, fear became another form of labor. Certain workers were responsible for watching for bad signs, strange behavior, or rule-breaking believed to anger the gods. They reported dreams, illness patterns, or unusual events. This job placed workers under constant pressure to interpret normal events as dangerous. Wrong reports brought blame. Silence could be punished. Living in fear became part of daily work. Cities also required constant rebuilding, not only of walls and homes, but of temporary structures like stalls, barriers, platforms, and fences. These were built and torn down repeatedly for markets, rituals, or visits by leaders. Workers lifted, tied, repaired, and removed materials day after day. Their effort left no lasting trace. Once the structure was gone, so was evidence of their work. Another overlooked everyday burden was carrying the city's emotional weight. In early cities, there were people whose job was simply to stay present in places of distress. They stood near courts, temples, and gathering areas, watching for signs of trouble. They calmed grieving families, restrained angry individuals, and guided the confused. This work drained the mind more than the body. These workers absorbed stress that others released. Children born into cities often inherited the worst jobs without choice. From an early age, they carried water, swept areas, watched animals, or assisted in workshops. Their bodies adapted to labor early, but injuries followed them into adulthood. City life shaped them to accept constant work as normal. As cities expanded, the gap between visible achievement and invisible labor grew wider. Leaders planned, priests spoke, and traders profited, while everyday workers repeated the same tasks endlessly. The worst jobs were not rare accidents. They were permanent roles created by city life itself. In early cities, work did not end when one task was finished. A person might carry water in the morning, help repair a wall at midday, and grind grain at night. There was no clear line between work and rest. Even when sitting, people were alert, listening for orders, calls, or trouble. The city demanded attention at all times. This constant readiness was tiring in a deep way that sleep alone could not fix. Many people worked jobs that changed with the season, but never became easier. During planting time, they worked fields. During floods, they repaired damage. During shortages, they guarded food. During festivals, they cleaned and controlled crowds. During sickness, they cared for others or removed the dead. There was no period of true relief. One form of effort simply replaced another. The city also decided value. Some jobs were seen as clean and important. Others were seen as dirty or low, even if they were necessary. People doing the worst everyday jobs knew they were needed, but they also knew they were avoided. This created a quiet separation inside the city, not marked by walls, but by looks, distance, and silence. Children learned early which paths led upward and which led nowhere. As years passed, bodies carried the marks of work clearly. Bent backs, worn joints, missing teeth, scars, and tired eyes were common. There were no healers who could fix years of strain. Pain became part of normal life. People adjusted their movements, slowed their pace, and kept working anyway. Stopping was rarely an option. Cities also remembered debt longer than people remembered kindness. A missed delivery, a broken tool, a lost sack of grain could follow a worker for years. Debt turned into forced labor. Forced labor turned into a life without choice. Many of the worst everyday jobs were filled by people caught in this cycle, working not to improve their lives, but simply to avoid punishment. Even those who enforced rules were trapped by them. Guards, supervisors, and watchers lived under constant pressure. If they were too strict, people hated them. If they were too soft, leaders punished them. Their work offered little safety. They slept lightly, always aware that anger could turn toward them at any moment. As cities grew older, traditions formed around work. People stopped asking why things were done a certain way. They accepted that some people always cleaned, some always carried, some always guarded, and some always decided. The city taught everyone their place through routine, not words. This made the system strong, but also hard to change. The worst everyday job, then, became living inside a structure that needed constant effort, but offered little control in return. The city gave protection from wild danger, but replaced it with endless obligation. People were safer from sudden death, but faced slow exhaustion instead. At night, when the city grew quieter, this weight did not disappear. Fires dimmed, voices lowered, animals settled. But many people lay awake thinking about the next day's work, the next order, the next shortage. Rest was never complete, because the city itself never fully slept. Over generations, these early cities shaped how humans understood work. They taught that progress came from repetition, that stability required sacrifice, and that comfort was unevenly shared. The first cities were great achievements, but they were built on everyday jobs that drained the body and mind slowly over time. The people who did the worst work did not leave behind names or statues. They left behind functioning streets, stored food, clean water paths, standing walls, and routines that allowed cities to last. Their reward was survival, not recognition. As you listen quietly now, you can imagine the slow rhythm of one of these cities settling into darkness. Somewhere, a worker finishes sweeping a street. Somewhere else, someone guards a doorway. Another person carries water one last time before rest. None of them know they are part of history. They are simply doing what must be done. And in that way, the worst everyday job in the first cities was also the most important. It was showing up again and again, without praise, without relief, and without knowing how far their effort would reach into the future. If you enjoy calm and peaceful history stories like this one, please consider subscribing. Your support truly helps these quiet stories continue. Thank you for watching, and rest well.